we
Okay.
left off.
And then do me a favor and tell people what happened with the encoder, okay?
Okay, hopefully people are reconnecting. I'll give you the same link just in case. Okay, let me just check, make sure we're live now.
Okay.
Okay, so welcome back. Hopefully people will reconnect. We momentarily lost our live stream due to what appears to be an encoder crash.
Okay, so this is a new link. Do you want me to change all the links to this link? Do you think that that's the thing to do?
I think it's going to be same actually, but
okay, so let's ask if people hear us and ask them to give us feedback if they hear us now. That's what's important, rather than giving them a new link, which will probably only confuse them. Does that make sense? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you sure that you can't kind of explain to them exactly what happened just now with losing the encoder? Give them a little.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I brought myself back. So for a moment there, hello and welcome back again to Critical Missions. So for a moment there, it appears that our encoder has disappeared or crashed. So we had a disruption and we have restarted now and are transmitting, and we're just waiting for people to reconnect, and we'll be along very, very shortly. Douglas is here, and we also had a, maybe it got knocked out because our Skype connection was very poor to the point where I didn't hear Douglas, so a bit of a network problem somehow developed.
Well, probably sabotage. To tell you the truth. We are definitely more and more of a threat these days than ever before. So if you feel you've explained it adequately, then I'll take over at this point and start with my shout outs then. Okay, so I guess executive producer Pavel Pravara has brought us back from the dead. I am getting a message from Daniel Arola. He is hearing us, so I will appreciate messages from anyone else to verify such. And I want to thank Daniel Arola for what he has delivered. Judith Agert has informed myself the first time that I went off. I know that other people are also leaving messages likely to that effect in the various links we provided. So let's take a look at what the links are saying now. The new stream has been put up by Kane Lawless. So he's listening to us on the new stream. So if we really need a new stream, then what I'll do is I will take that link and I will change it. So I'll at least change the link. I am going to hear my own echo now for a second, and now we're going to take the share button and get this particular link up here, and I will change it in all of the right areas, and people can hear me while I monotone to myself. At the same time, the old link will also be up, so people may be getting us in two separate areas, so we might double our coverage with that, because I know that something similar has happened in the past, and then it'll be up to of course my executive producer to essentially handle that. And what I will do is also put up this link by itself, and this will be the new link, and this will always also be published. And so I'll say new link in all caps, new live stream link, live stream link. New live stream linkage. Okay, and okay, so let's press the share button on that, and so we will also get a kind of a feedback from Ramona Halitha Henry. Meanwhile, going to edit this other post, and I thank everybody who's being so patient with this on a Sunday night when we're having heavy traffic issues and everything seems to be going as wrong as it can possibly go. But there we have that. Lost you both, but I'm hearing you now loud and clear from Brandon Young. And Jerry Small says, lost you for a minute. She thought it was her computer acting up. It is not. And so as for Ramona Halitha Henry's post, she's got that up somewhere, her Golden Star. I recommend everyone seek out the Golden Star published by Ramona Halitha Henry. And that, of course, is what provides many other links that back up what I say, kind of serve as a vetting for what I bring up. And we're told again that it sounds fine. Hearing now clearly, Kane Lawless has also put up his other post to link us with the new live stream link. And with that said, one more thing to do on this page. Unpin this other live link, get the other one set up, and at the bottom of the hour, I will get started. And I want to, again, thank everyone for their infinite patience with this, and deeply love and appreciate you all. Okay, new live stream linkage link. And hate to talk out loud while I do this sort of thing because I always feel vaguely senile when I do that. It makes me feel as if I'm talking to myself. And so, oh well, such is life. And okay, pinned to the top of the page. Took care of that. And we'll once again just add that new live stream link as a backup to these two other posts. And we will be on our way for the night. So everyone do talk to us in terms of sending messages via both of my Facebook timelines as to the audio quality. We definitively need to hear your feedback, and that's what keeps us aware of how things are going. Sarah Shields says she could hear us just fine, but that was 28 minutes ago. And now finally the last post to change this on as we go to the bottom of the hour, and then I'll get started ranting for the night. Which is what everyone has gathered, is to hear me vent and cathart and therapeutically release my my aggressions on the world, or frustrations, express my frustrations with the world. Okay, so with that in mind, boys and girls, here's our tonight's shout-outs, as always, to our executive producer, Pavel Pravara, who has spent the opening half hour dealing with a number of assaults on our ability to communicate with yourself. We are a deadly threat to the paedopathocracy and the satanic world anti-order. So they are doing their best to take us out before we even got started tonight. We suffered no less than a cutoff on our Skype, and we suffered as well a cutoff of the encoder, which crashed on us, which is not supposed to be happening with the amount of power that we now have with the kind of services that have been brought to bear under command of my executive producer, Pavel Pravara. Our shout out to Ramona Halitha Henry, the closest that we have to a mistress of our chat room, in the closest that we have to a chat room, my personal friends page on Facebook. I advise everyone to follow myself on www.facebook.com/Douglas D. Dietrich. As well, I want to bring to everyone's attention a wonderful new blog spot established by our Maki benefactress. We have a web mistress for it in the form of our fangirl, Lena Shea, and she has done a wonderful job with this brand new blog spot that's out there. As a matter of fact, Pavel Pravara may be aware of it. If so, I hope that he provides myself a link that I can provide to other people, because it's going to take me a while to scroll for this baby, because with all of the new posts that have been placed upon my timeline, everything collapses on Facebook into what I call clusterfucks, and it pretty much eliminates my ability to find anything that's posted by anyone other than myself, which is really fucking annoying. So this wonderful link provided to myself concerning the new Blogspot is not something I'm able to give yourselves at the moment, but it should be linked via my website, ΔGlassDietrich.com. So I advise everyone to check out www.DouglasDietrich.com. The last thing I can do to try and find this is to actually go into private messages, and it may actually have been sent to myself there. And with that in mind, hopefully I can provide you all the necessary linkage there too. So if I can just get past the kind of other communiques, and here we are. This may be it with our latest Blogspot link. So far I'm getting kind of a page not found. It may have been taken down, but other than that, let's see now. DouglasDietrich.com /2019/05/08. So you should be able to find it on DouglasDietrich.com. All right. So the latest link, which I thought might even be a separate site, is on the major website. In the meantime, we can get started with my raving about the world. And but before that, a few more shout outs to people who very much have earned it. And I want to thank, of course, my volcano-crowned Princess of the Pacific, and she has been listening to us from Hawaii. We were coming in clear. Hopefully we still are. If she's able to hear myself now, I hope that she indicates such. I thank her for being behind me, and will ask her if, you know, the typical Verizon question, can you hear me now? And hopefully get a response there. Other than that, I know that Daniel Arola is listening. He has his own channel, and that channel is very special in that he has taken snippets, some of them quite short, some of them quite large, and he creates videos with them based on many of my shows, and that's to be found at Taboo Bros 2. Do subscribe there. Taboo is spelled in the classical sense, T-A-B-O-O. There's a space after that, and then Bros, B-R-O-S, and Taboo Bros 2 is the place to find some very succinct bullet points that are shared by Daniel Arola. I also want to bring attention, of course, to our man, Mr. Jonathan Warrington, without whom I would not have the archives that I'm able to present to the world now. Jonathan Warrington has the Maggot channel. You can find that on YouTube easily by looking up Maggot Douglas Dietrich. It's an English thing. I've never understood it. I'm quite sure I never want to understand it, but for some reason, there are a million, well, at least half 100 Maggot channels on YouTube, and they all trace back to Englishmen. What that's about, I have no idea. Don't care to find out. But you'll find my Maggot channel run by, of course, our archivist, the Grand Magator, Jonathan Warrington, at www.youtube.com/c/Magator. Magator being spelled Magagotaur, and the Grand Magator, John Warrington, could always use some financial support to maintain the archives, and you can send him such by pressing the £sterling button. If you're in a nation that uses the British pound, a member of the Commonwealth of English-speaking nations that are still part of the £sterling dominated exchange rate system, and if so, you can send him a £1 by pressing that symbol in the upper right-hand corner of his Facebook page. And of course, that would be at www.facebook.com/John.War, W-A-R. And you can also mail him something via PayPal in any currency, I would suspect, via his email address, which would be john_war@hotmail.com. john_war@hotmail.com. And as for the archives themselves, once you're on the Maggot channel, the sub-channel, which contains all of my archives, is tinyurl.com/showsdd. make certain that you subscribe to Taboo Bros as well as that. And a shout out as well to the lovely young Selena Khan, a wonderful human being. Will be catching up with herself in the very near future. Everything that I'm dealing with right now demands a lot of my attention, but things should stabilize hopefully towards the end of this week or into the weekend. Shout out to the marvelous young lady Jess Raj and Rogi. Her husband's name is Rogi. So she is, of course, involved with Strange Tales Weekly, as is Joe Boyer. Shout out to their friend Eric as well, all of the kids over at the Strange Tales Weekly crew. Shout out to Salman Sheikh, wonderful human being, sent myself $250. Very, very helpful. Ramadan Mubarak. And as well, a shout out to Ben Estenius. And with that, we take off. Basically, let me tell you a bit about everything that's going on in the world right now in, shall we say, a thread that is connected. There's a connected thread between global warming and the latest school shooting in Colorado. Now, it is pointed that this took place at a STEM school. STEM is acronymous for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Without STEM, we cannot maintain civilization. The way to kill civilization is to kill people involved in STEM, our future, and to kill the people who, of course, become involved in our future ability to maintain our electronic and information infrastructure. Now, when you discourage people from going to a school because of these kinds of killings, and they're prevented, therefore, from pursuing a career in STEM, upon which our future depends. Just look at Pavel and myself trying to communicate with yourselves tonight. It's all based on STEM. If you discourage people from pioneering the maintenance of this infrastructure, then it's as good as killing them. Just by them not entering this field, just by discouraging them from attending school to enter this field, they're as good as dead to the infrastructure which we ourselves rely on. And in that case, with the collapse of said infrastructure, we all die. We cannot live anymore without the exchange of information. The problem is that just like the air we breathe, just because you subsist on air, just because you cannot live without water, doesn't mean that all air is good and all water is good. You will be killed by toxins in the air based on industrial effluvia when they become pervasive enough. You will die drinking toxic water polluted by industrial output. So too, the information pollution is destroying your mind, your ability to think, your ability to process, your ability to understand truth. All of this is being done by the motherfucking Russians. We are at war. This is World War. And as a great Canadian man once said, Marshall McLuhan, World War III is an information war that makes no distinction between military and civilians. You are the battlefield. Specifically, your brain is the battlefield. What the Russians are seeking via the mutation of your mind is the damnation of your soul. Now, in terms of how this relates to climate change, what happened was a president named Donald Trump was elected who wants to do away with any struggle to contain climate change. He was elected via Russian machinations in an act of war in which they hacked our electoral system. And this is because Moscow's own response to climate change is Bring it on. As the motherless Russians ponder a future of warming temperatures throughout the Arctic and much of Siberia, the Kremlin has adopted an approach that be completely unique, exceptional in the most negative sense among all the world's governments, which be that climate change is something they wish to accelerate. While many parts of the world are struggling from catastrophic effects of climate change, Russia is looking to capitalize upon it, with the Kremlin driving a narrative that touts the economic benefits of the rest of humanity diving into extinction. Like more and faster access to petroleum and mineral reserves that were previously unreachable throughout Eurasia, the Northern Sea Passage, a legendary shipping lane along Russia's Arctic coastline, has been largely inaccessible for part of the year because of dense sea ice, requiring nuclear icebreakers to render it tenable at all. But now, all that ice is melting, opening up a new ocean and a completely free trade route dominated only by the military control of the Russian Empire, wherein their cargo ships can travel utilizing that polar access to the rest of the world, but they can control whoever comes into their world. If that route were completely free for international access, like the Straits of the Bosporus, on which sits astride the ancient Byzantine capital of Constantinople, now Istanbul, the most strategic passage in all the world, there is required by international law international access. The Russians can go through there, as can any other nation, in interest of world trade. Were free passage allowed through the northern polar sea, Japan could reach New York City much faster by going through the northern passage between the Bering Strait and then through the Isles of northern Canada in the autonomous region of Nunavut, all the way down through Greenland to New York. As massive a route as that may seem to traverse, it is remarkably faster, orders of magnitude quicker, than the Japanese using the Panama Canal and going in the southerly route through the Caribbean. But the Russians aren't going to allow anyone claiming that they own the North all the way to the North Pole. And they're going to back that up with military might. This is war, and they aim to choke off the rest of the world. Russian oil companies are already betting big on the new reserves they hope to find in the Russian Arctic, and other industries, like mining, are ramping up production since they now have faster shipping routes to many ports throughout the north. To quote the Nobel Prize winning climatologist of Eurasia, Oleg Anisimov, who works directly under command of Vladimir Putin. He says the problem of climate change is actually the problem of adaptation to climate change itself. The rest of humanity cannot adapt, but we Russians are the masters of the world. For us, this is no tragedy. Billions will die all over the rest of the world. The rest of the world will become unlivable. But Mother Russia is the one place on Earth that will become more habitable, more livable, more productive. It is our aim to see climate change through to the end, where only we live upon the world. Recent reports in the Russian media, as well as public studies and documents published by government ministries and science services, betray that Moscow, rather than embracing alternative energies or working to slash carbon emissions, is looking at ways to increase them all, while they take global warming in stride and actually profit from mass extinction. Nowhere is this strategy more apparent than in the Russian Arctic, where Moscow sees an economic boom ushered in by rising temperatures, melting ice, and mass extinction. According to Rosgidromy, the Russian National Weather Service, temperatures throughout the Russian Federation, circa just yesteryear, were all 2 degrees above normal. In the polar region, those temperatures were even higher, some 4 degrees above normal. Meanwhile, the volume of the Arctic's oldest and thickest ice has decreased by an astonishing 95%, as evidenced by a study from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration within these United States. The news for the rest of the world is just as bad. In its most recent devastating report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change envisions a world of fires, floods, famines, major superstorms of increased intensity, and global temperature spikes of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2040. But Russia is embracing the warmth. President Vladimir Putin has long been on record both questioning that humans be responsible for climate change at all and asserting that global warming be part of a natural cycle that would, of course, benefit the Russian economy. Vladimir Putin also once famously declared that climate change would mean the Russians would save money on fur coats and boost the wheat harvest in Siberia to feed whatever be left of humanity that they deem worth feeding, in exchange for slavery. That statement, officially issued circa 2016, sparked an investment boom in Russian farmland from Donald Trump and fellow collaborationists, as Moscow's financial class placed bets on thawing permafrost, yielding arable land, and turning desolate Siberia, a frozen wasteland, into the breadbasket of planet Earth. All Russian industry is mobilized to follow the lead. Just before Christmas of yesteryear, the Yamal LNG, liquid natural gas project, a 27 billion United States dollars natural gas effort above the Arctic Circle, reached full capacity, thanks in large part to speculation that warming temperatures will ease polar hydrocarbon shipments from the icy roof of the world, militarily occupied by motherfucking Russia. Rosatom, Russia's nuclear energy corporation, now has oversight of the Northern Sea route, the 6,000-kilometer east-west Arctic Sea corridor, which heralds a build-out of far northern ports and other key infrastructure on the backs of an ever-expanding nuclear icebreaker fleet. And last year, Vladimir Putin himself not so much hoped as ordered that cargo traffic being shipped through the Arctic increased to 80 million tons a year, a fourfold hike over current levels, in a bid to turn the Northern Sea route into a polar rival to the Suez Canal. International shippers have begun to test the waters under Russian armed escort, which they're forced to pay for. Last summer, surrendering to Russia, Danish shipper Maersk, M-A-E-R-S-K, sent a container ship from Busan, Korea, to St. Petersburg by way of the Arctic. But Russia's hands-off approach to the dangers of climate change isn't doing the rest of the world any good, especially since it's hands-on with its puppet president Donald Trump, rebuking any existence of climate change whatsoever, denying the very phenomena, and causing the one empire in the world that can stop it, the United States, to increase its pollution to the point where the extinction of 1 million species has been calculated. One of those species in that million, other animals and insects and plants and fish, be humanity itself. At December's climate summit in Poland, yes, JeSTER, at which the United Nations hoped to finalize national commitments to the Paris Climate Accord, Russia formed an axis of evil, an anti-environmental axis of climate skeptic nations, comprising the most worthless peoples in the world: Russia, its American puppet, the United States, the House of Saud on the Arabian Peninsula, and joining Russia, the United States, and Saudi Arabia was Poland itself. This is why the Poles don't even deserve their own nation. This is why the Germans refer to whatever goes wrong in the world as Polish management. These four worthless populations gathered in an effort to water down the gathering's final statement per climate change, rather than sign on to language that would have welcomed the IPCC report. Russia and its puppet satellite states, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Poland, preferred only that the devastation predicted, calculated per climate change, of 1 million species going extinct within our generation, as so tabulated and exposed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change itself, was simply acknowledged as duly noted, as opposed to a problem, a crisis, to be preempted. May all those people perish from the face of the earth that do not resist their governments in this drive towards human extinction on behalf of a Russian empire over the dead. Moscow's reluctance to grapple with climate change will have disastrous effects, not only to the rest of the world, but to itself. According to a study published last month or yesteryear by the science journal Nature, Russia's current climate policies will push up global temperatures by well over 5 degrees Celsius, at least 3 degrees higher than the limit climate scientists are aiming for. And still, the path of ignoring climate change in favor of reaping more wheat and turning the Arctic into a shipping superhighway is having local consequences that the Russians themselves are simply ignoring in their propaganda that they publish for their own peoples. The Russians themselves are suffering, but Vladimir Putin doesn't care. Vladimir Putin doesn't care how many of his own people will die, that the elite can reap its benefits off their carcasses and cadavers. Last summer, wildfires engulfing all Siberia. If you can even envision what I'm saying, Siberia itself, a land of snow and ice, burst into flames. Flames so powerful, they could be seen from space. Wildfires so massive, so devastating, they wiped out entire species of Arctic animal. The biggest firestorm seen since 2008. There's smoke reaching all the way across the Pacific, to the point where our lungs were choking on burning Siberian woodland, blazing tundra here in San Francisco. Deadly floods washed across the southern Krasnodar region, the very area which hosted the 2014 Winter Olympics, when October superstorms brought several months' worth of rain in just 48 hours. In March this year, thousands of people were evacuated in Siberia's Altai region after snow caps that don't usually melt actually did so and flooded the settlements below, drowning entire herds of reindeer off which the people lived, forcing them to rely on food distributed by caprice and whim from settlement cities, massive evacuation centers that they had to be redistributed into throughout the Gulag archipelago that once housed political prisoners. And while Moscow bankers might be betting on a future farmland as all the tundra melts and burns, the Russian Empire's current farmland is getting battered by droughts. And yet, the white Russian people, the greater Russian Slavic population, be entirely unaware, wrapped in a matrix of pure propaganda media, they be entirely unconcerned about the environmental impacts of these climate change-related catastrophes, like the pollution from the booming factories and the super firestorms in the north that just within the last few months destroyed 1 million acres of forest in a major tourism area. So will Moscow's self-evident policy of embracing climate change truly pay off? That remains to be seen. But at the very least, the kleptocracy of mass murderers and gangsters surrounding Vladimir Putin will be saving money on fur coats. Now, I brought up before a science fiction story of the 1980s, published by an individual in San Francisco whom I myself peripherally know, Richard A. Moran, a noted San Francisco-based business leader, venture capitalist, best-selling author, and president emeritus of Menlo College, a college at which I myself was once interviewed. That interview being in storage there, and as far as I know, inaccessible to myself unless I pursue it. I've never had the time to follow up. It was shown on their own college television station, seen throughout Silicon Valley. One of the reasons why I'm actually a low-level micro-celebrity, even among the Silicon Valley elite, inflaming the jealousy of one of my primary gang stalkers, Stephen Outram. who asked myself out for $1 million, which I turned down, and thereafter vowed to destroy myself. Since then, spending his millions of dollars, employing gang stalkers in turn, like Richard K. Cole, who has boasted of being paid $1 million so he can spend every moment of his waking life gang stalking myself. All of this ultimately traces to Michael Aquino. These are the cultists of the kings of Edom, the anti-gods. I once spoke of them to Richard A. Moran, back when he was the 10th president of Menlo College, itself a private four-year college located in the heart of Silicon Valley. He is the first former president there given the emeritus status for his contributions. Moran himself previously served as chief executive officer and vice chairman at Accretive Solutions, a national professional services firm with a focus on accounting, information technology, and outsourcing. Accretive Solutions was sold in December of 2017 to Resources Global Professionals. The beginning of Richard Moran's career in the Silicon Valley was a management role in the early days of Atari. You might remember ATARI, all caps, the name of your first video games if you're half a century old like myself. If you're one of our younger listeners, you won't even remember Atari. That was pixelated boxes that gave us games like Pong. Atari, of course, is a Japanese word. Shout it in victory when one wins a board game. It transferred over into videos. At the time, of course, as everything else, the Japanese influence created our postmodern world. Since those days, Richard Moran's been involved in companies big and small, with success and failure, and personally witnessed the growth and change of innovation. As a man of Celtic heritage, he related to my late and sainted sire, George Joseph Henry Dietrich. And as two Irishmen, they spent a few days drinking. Now, Rich Moran serves on the management team of the Irish Technology Leadership Group, being a partner at SVG or Savage Partners, and he be a member of the Global Irish Network, a network launched circa 2010, comprising 350 of the most senior Irish and Irish-connected business people from over 40 nations. The reason this puts him at the vanguard of tomorrow is because with Brexit and the coming death of Britain, unless it resurrects itself, as I advise, via pioneering GMO or genetically modified organismal technologies to feed itself, since it will be unable to get any food conveniently from the European continent. The only way Britain can feed itself is via GMO agriculture, food grown in laboratories. By revolutionizing such an effort, Britain could mobilize that into trade and feed the rest of the world that would otherwise die under the Russian assault on our very environment, via genetically modified organisms that could grow under conditions that would otherwise be impossible for agricultural development. All of that will become a necessity for saving all humanity, and the British Empire could finally find itself on the right side of history. In the interim, because Britain has rendered itself useless to the world, Ireland has arisen to take its place as the most accessible and least corrupt of all the English-speaking nations. An economic alternative to places like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, where enormous problems have been encountered in the service industry. Right now, Dublin, the Irish capital, is the 9th largest city in Europe, Ireland being part of European Union. Just as London was made the financial capital of the world via its connections to European Union, with its rebuke of Europe, Ireland will become the replacement for British Empire as the outlet to the Atlantic. And Dublin will become the London of tomorrow. In terms of radio, Rich Moran was a radio personality featured on KCBS Radio in San Francisco, being the host of In the Workplace, a program that discusses workplace issues and airs weekly to over 1 million listeners, with topics including dogs at work, working from home, and playing hooky. He's a frequent speaker on achieving success as well as workplace issues and has appeared on National Public Radio, Bloomberg TV, and other media outlets. But my interest was always his writing. Richard Moran is the founding partner of Blue Book Ventures, a firm focused on early-stage companies in educational technology, what they call EdTech, and related fields. The focus is on technologies and products that solve a problem. And in this regard, Moran published 8 business books. He's best known for a series of humorous business books, beginning with the best-selling work entitled Never Confuse a Memo with Reality, that started the genre of business bullet books. One of his later books was entitled The Thing About Work, Showing Up, and Other Important Matters, a worker's manual, and that was released in October of 2016. His work's been translated into 8 languages, and one of his books was actually converted into a calendar with daily reminders and distributed widely on college campuses as a leadership manual. But of everything he's done in his life, what always stood out for me the most was the novel, a science fiction novel originally published circa 1986 entitled Cold Sea Rising. And that novel, based on science, in 1986, mind you, was about a manned Soviet satellite in polar orbit 240 miles high above the Earth, probing a dense, unseasonable fog over Antarctica, and finding that the Ross ice shelf had broken away, drifting north toward the warm waters of the Pacific Ocean. Now, because of the melting of Antarctic ice, predicted by Richard Moran generations gone by now, tidal waves within the conceit of the narrative of the novel itself threatened to surge out of Antarctica and wreak havoc upon the world. But American scientists saved the day in the personalities, the characters of a hard-working but predictable disaster novel, it being Moran's first novelization, his first work in fiction. I wouldn't say it was exactly engaging in character development. Its characters were cut along the dotted line, but they served their purpose. The action all started within the narrative that I remember at around McMurdo Sound, Antarctica, in what was then still the future, 1999, with an enormous ice-shattering explosion that rocked the American Antarctic Research Station, and of course, prompting the beautiful glaciologist Melissa McCoy, the first human being conceived and born into Antarctica, which has since happened with people. There are born Antarcticans at this point in history by now. Back then, that was still in the future. So this woman born upon the ice in the novel gets sent aloft in a helicopter to investigate and brings back terrifying news. A massive underwater volcano has erupted, melting the ice bridges that anchor the Ross Ice Shelf, which itself be twice the size of New Zealand, to the Antarctic continent, and the entire shelf was then bobbing in the Pacific like an ice cube in a highball, and in its absence, the West Antarctic ice sheet began to melt rapidly due to fierce volcanic action which, if left unchecked, would cause water levels around the world to rise 20 feet or more, in turn causing tidal waves which, within the novel, began to flood port cities and inundate low-lying coastlines all across the globe. Now, into all that ensuing catastrophe stepped Melissa's father, Admiral Waldo Rankin, a gruff old Antarctic expert of the I don't take any bull from cowering politicians even if they are the president type. And the White House allowed him to gather a crisis team, in which he appointed the famous New York Times reporter Josh McCoy, a fictional character within arc of narrative of this novel, mind you, and Melissa's estranged husband, this reporter, of course, being her ex, because he found out that she was, to use a pun, in light of the environment, frigid, preferring penguins to parenting. So he's serving now as media liaison, and he's secretly contacted by the Russian geologist Anya Sherpin, his mistress when he was Moscow bureau chief, who informs him that the Soviets are planning on using the Ross Ice Shelf as a super icecraft carrier, a base for military operations against the world. Now, because the whole world's been inundated, with all of its coastlines left ravaged and defenseless, there is no port defense because all of the bombers, interceptors, various other militarily capable assets are just as vulnerable on the coast as human cities. The end result, of course, because the United States is left defenseless other than by a strategic strike using nuclear weapons against Russia. The president backs down, and the Russians are set to take over the world. But within the conceit of the novel, the mighty Russian bear, unbelievably clumsy as it is, trips over its own paws. And knowing what I do about how the Russians operate, this is actually quite realistic. And within arc of narrative, they wind up drowning their entire invasion force after one of their own subs inadvertently sets off a nuclear missile under the shelf. And then, free to concentrate on science, Waldo, Josh, and Melissa use Star Wars lasers developed by the Ronald Reagan Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI, meant to blast incoming Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles from out of the stratosphere as a star shield. They redeploy it against the Earth itself from orbiting satellites to silence the volcano and thereby save the day. Although the Ice Lady, the Ice Queen Melissa, dies in the attempt, and Josh be forced into the comforting embrace of Anya, who defects. All in all, spectacular special effects, unexceptional otherwise. And why does it even matter? Because, as I've explained before, Vladimir Putin doesn't need to break away subcontinents of ice sheet into super ice craft carriers that would actually be quite practical when maneuvered for launching actual bombers off of, thereby saving an enormous amount of logistical effort. Something that if the Americans had during World War II, broken bits of Antarctic ice sheet to launch their bombers from, they would never have had to have suffered 4 years of an island hopping campaign in order to gain airstrips towards the ultimate bombing of Japan. Militarily, the novel makes perfect sense. None of that is necessary now, because primarily, Russia is incapable of following up militarily. Unlike the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation is a straw giant, a paper tiger, an empty vessel, utterly impotent. Its performance in Syria or any place else is limited by direct logistical lines to Moscow. Its victories in Syria were entirely conditional on the nation of Armenia being the military hub for Russian Empire in area from which Russia could attack Southwest Asia. Barring that kind of connectivity across the seas, Russia would have no capability of mounting invasive assets on breakaway ice sheets at this point in history. So far more economically, far more practically, far less spectacularly, but far more gruesomely, Vladimir Putin has turned towards a rising tide of human sewage. He's flooded the underworld of the internet with Russian memes and propaganda that have politicized and weaponized an international sewer of white trash turds who have gone on full assault to take out the future of greater cultures and better peoples the world over. And the latest attack has taken place in Colorado. And once again, America suffers from yet another school shooting. We feel the pain, once again, that will ultimately destroy us. There's only so much pain a people can take before they break in terms of morale when it comes to the horror of the little thing, the mosquito attack, the minor issues that, like radiation, prove cumulative and ultimately break a nation asunder. Whereas mass bombings mobilize and unite a people in a common agony against an obvious enemy. The school shootings are meant to appear random, chaotic, and therefore enter the realm of the anti-gods, the realm of chaos. And in terms of this Colorado STEM Highlands Ranch school shooting, it's proven in its own way more an embodiment and a personification of chaos than anything before it. a week after 2 people were shot to death at a North Carolina college. The nation of these United States is facing the horror of school shootings all over again in the person of the victims, comprised of 1 student killed and 8 others critically injured, after 2 white trash pieces of shit entered 2 classrooms at the STEM school Highlands Ranch in suburban Denver and opened fire. These 2 school shooters, both believed to be students, were taken into custody after a struggle with police. Some of the students at the school reportedly tried to tackle one of the shooters. The school is but 7 miles away from Columbine High School, where 2 shooters killed 13 people circa 1999 and became indicative of a new wave of mass murderer. To reiterate, STEM, Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics School, STEM School Highlands Ranch, which has a student body of about nigh 2,000 students, 1,850 to be precise, is just 8 miles southeast of Columbine High School, the site of the Hitler Day mass shooting, in which 2 white trash pieces of shit decided to desecrate the Führer's birthday, April 20th, that 1999th year of our Lord, in a mass shooting in which these young gunmen that year murdered 12 fellow students and a teacher before killing themselves. In this massacre, after first saying the suspect was a juvenile male, officials have since clarified that a young student in a United States Marine Corps delayed entry program, known as a poolee before they enter boot camp and become a recruit, tackled one of the young gunmen, taking the school apart, before that young gunman even had a chance to fire off a single shot, thereby limiting the murder and injuries caused by this pair to the other gunman who was not so confronted in a separate classroom. This young gunman, who was preemptively tackled by the future Marine while attempting to open fire, has now been clarified by officials as being female. The tackled young girl, who has not been identified, was apparently very much under the influence of the legal adult male of the pair, 18-year-old Devon Erickson. Yes, his name is spelled exactly the same as that man who truly did discover America for Europe, Leif Erikson, the Viking of old. And the unidentified girl, along with Devon Erickson, were apprehended on their targeting of these 2 separate areas of the STEM school Highlands Ranch yesterday afternoon. Now, I called the department to find out what I could in Denver, Colorado. I was told by investigators that the tackled shall I say, Marine Corps tackled shooter who was presumed to be a juvenile male, they confirmed is a small young female. Someone who, while a student at the school, must have at the most just entered as a fresh girl. The authorities admitted to myself and have since admitted openly and publicly, to quote as they, the identity wasn't obvious to us when they were taken into custody. Apparently, the young fresh girl and Erickson knew each other and would sometimes carpool to school together, which is how she fell under his deadly influence. Erickson himself had recently posted a senior photo on his Facebook page, where he listed Pokemon and The Walking Dead as his interests, along with several pop bands. He had also posted pictures of himself acting on stage in Legally Blonde, the musical, and Les Miserables at a local community theater. So he had a sense of drama and a flair for the theatrical. On his YouTube page, he had posted videos of himself singing, and his mini bio on Twitter read, "I make music, I guess." Erickson's 56-year-old mother, Stephanie Erickson, told the New York Post today that the family needed a little time right now. When asked if she had any idea what would lead her son to carry out a school shooting, she said, "I don't know," through her tears. Today, District Attorney George Brockler said, "If you had suggested to anyone behind me or in this room that within 20 years and within 20 miles, we would have dealt with Columbine, the Aurora Theater Massacre, Arapahoe High School, the shooting of Zach Parrish, and 4 other deputies, we would have thought you mad. And yet, Mr. Dietrich, here we be again." And of course, the question inevitably, inescapably, inexorably must be, why? Because school shootings automatically produce more political polarization. Thoughts of death inspire us to cling ever more tightly to the beliefs that givest our lives meaning, or the delusion thereof, including our ideological stances, whether they be logical and rational, or illogical and irrational. And yet again, while America be grappling with the difficulty of finding mutually acceptable solutions in the wake of a mass shooting, this time at a science, technology, and engineering and mathematics school, producing the people that will maintain and further our new manifestation of postmodern civilization. With each new tragedy, hope ever arises that the horror will shock us finally into action. But instead, it ever drives legislators deeper into their ideological corners. New research reveals the psychological impulses that underlie this unhelpful hardening of positions, and suggests a possible pathway around them. In the journal Media Psychology, Esmo Jang, surname spelled Jang, of the University of South Carolina, writes that media coverage of mass shootings causes a boomerang effect among certain segments of the public, producing counterpressure against any and all necessary firearm safety reform initiatives. That's because thoughts of death lead people to align themselves ever more emphatically with the beliefs and institutions that they feel, not think, but feel, give us their lives whatever meaning they imagine. This idea stems from terror management theory, TMT, which itself be based on the seminal theories of the anthropologist Ernest Becker. I now quote the words of a 2011 study released during the very year my late and sainted Cyrus, forever shinest her name, Diana Zujin Lin Dietrich, that year she was murdered. According to this extensively researched school of thought, humans buffer their fear of death by construing the universe as an orderly, comprehensible, predictable, and meaningful place where death can be literally or symbolically transcended. That intense, oft semi-conscious need drives many to adhere more rigidly to the belief systems that allow them to make sense of their world. This can take the form of stronger allegiance to one's nation-state or faith, or increased devotion to an ideology that provides a sense of certainty, such as the strain of reactionary conservatism that opposes any and all gun laws. In 3 studies, Zhang showed how this dynamic can be triggered by mass shootings in particular. The first featured a diverse panel of 201 United States citizens who read a report about a recent massacre. At the time the study was conducted, that would be either San Bernardino or Sandy Hook. Or they were instead given a report that consisted of not more than a mundane news story about animals. They then completed a series of 25 word fragments, which could be turned into either death-related or non-death-related words. For example, cough, C-O-F-F with an underscore, to indicate that this was an incomplete term. Could be completed as either coffee or coffin. Of course, Donald Trump would say coffee. But for a more educated brand of humanity, it'd be the other 2 words. And as expected, those who read about a shooting were more likely to create death-related words, meaning mortality was on their minds. The second study featured 303 United States citizens, half of whom were instructed to respond to 1 prompt. Please describe briefly the emotions that the thought of your own death arouses in you. And 1 question. What do you think happens to you as you physically die, and once you be physically dead? The others responded to parallel questions by writing about watching television. After completing a brief interim task, all participants then answered a series of polling questions about gun control devised by the Pew Research Center. These included their level of support, if any, for stronger background checks and a ban on assault weapons. Zhang reports that Republicans who thought about their own death displayed a decreased level of support for any form of firearm safety reform, but an increased level of support for open carry. The positions of Democrats were never significantly impacted by the exercise at all. But the shift in Republican views resulted in greater political polarization. Thereby, Zhang isolated the Republicans as the catalyst group for political polarization in America. They be at fault. They be the ideological aggressor, reactive based on fear, irrationality, and mental illness. These results, mind you, were replicated in the third and final study, proving the fault lies with republicanism, a flawed and corrupt ideology of fear. Zhang writes that to avoid this reactionary Republican backlash effect, the findings suggest gun control advocates should take care not to overly trigger death concerns among the Republic. That will, of course, be a tall order. But it seems clear that people who be reminded of their mortality oft retreat to the perceived safety of their rigid ideology, to reflexive, reactionary response. And that in and of itself be an enormous impediment to ever possibly finding common ground. So that means, of course, it's time to talk about the NRA, the National Rifle Association, which paved the way for mass shootings. 'Tis the power of the gun lobby what has made Americans vulnerable to terror. The greatest threat to our homeland security today be the National Rifle Association, a front group for the firearms industry that derails gun safety measures and perversely profits with each and every new mass shooting. The Senate Judiciary Committee found that Russia funded the entire Donald Trump campaign via the NRA. The Senate Judiciary Committee concluded that NRA leadership be proven tools evil enough to have made themselves a channel for funneling illegal foreign money that floated Trump's entire 2016 campaign. But most damning to myself, the fact that Americans who maintain gun ownership is insurance against our own United States government now all be willing Russian insurgents. These are the same people who say we must have the Second Amendment right to bear arms to protect ourselves against our own government, that all government becomes tyranny, and the only way to overthrow such government be by mobilization of the armed citizenry, meaning these are revolutionaries, these are communists, these are Bolsheviks, and now they are out and out traitors, collaborators with the Russians who wish to bring on mass extinction to the world. Via the Daily Beast just yesteryear, the Senate Judiciary Committee said Wednesday, July 18th, 2018, that the Russian government apparently used the National Rifle Association to float Donald Trump's entire presidential campaign throughout 2016. According to report on the panel's preliminary findings on Russia and the presidential campaign, the committee has obtained a number of documents that suggest the Kremlin used the National Rifle Association as a means of assessing and assisting Mr. Trump and his campaign throughout. Now, said report so states, the NRA was used to secretly fund Mr. Trump's campaign. While the report didn't discuss the documents themselves, it confirmed that two Russian nationals, Alexander Torshin, and Maria Butina were involved in this effort. Torshin, a member of Russia's central bank, hosted a National Rifle Association delegation in Moscow circa 2013. Butina, founder of a pro-firearms group in Russia itself, boasted at a Washington District of Columbia party following the election that she was part of the Trump campaign's communications with Russia. And the FBI revealed that this Russian spy exploited the NRA as back channel to the Republican Party. On July 18th, yesteryear, the Russian spy Marina Butina entered a plea before the United States Magistrate Judge Deborah Robinson about violating federal laws by failing to register herself as a foreign agent of the Russian Federation. But that technical violation, which started years ago, was no news to Butina, to her Russian handler, or to her back channel to the Republican Party, the gun lobby itself, otherwise known as the National Rifle Association. Butina was arrested the 15th of July last year at her District of Columbia area home after FBI senior agent Kevin Helson filed a sworn affidavit and detailed charges against her with Judge Robinson. The arrest, announced the very next day, came just before President Donald Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Helson outlined Butina's contacts with the Republican Party and the National Rifle Association and her plan to set up back-channel communications between the Russian Federation's government and the Republican Party as a hostile insurgency against the American public via the all-powerful gun lobby. Her objective? Turning the Republicans away from their traditional hard line against Russia and its predecessor, the Soviet Union, instead collaborating with Russia as an occupation government. Helson said there's much more evidence to come. Butina bragged, "It doesn't matter anymore because Russia won the war, and her operations were a complete success." Though Helson doesn't ID the gun lobby by name, his affidavit's description, calling it the largest gun rights organization in these United States and a major influence on both the Republican Party and all congressional elections, makes it painfully obvious who he be talking about. The Russian agent Maria Butina, with the NRA Executive Vice President Wayne LaPierre, are both people who deserve the death sentence. Spies are executed. What be missing is how much money Butina funneled from Russia to the Republican Party via the National Rifle Association. Under pressure from Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat, of course, from Oregon, several months ago, we're talking around the time of the midterm elections, the NRA's general counsel admitted that Butina's Russian handler and sponsor, Alexander Torshin, deputy governor of the Russian Central Bank, has been an NRA life member for decades. The NRA said it found a total loss of less than $25,000 in income from people with Russian addresses, most of it in subscriptions and annual dues. Understandably, after Butina's arrest, Wyden's staff questions if the NRA is even telling the truth. And other campaign finance sources point out the NRA was the major donor of all so-called dark money to the Republicans in general and the Trump campaign in particular throughout the 2015 through 2016 election cycle to the tune of well over $36 million United States dollars. Two analysts of money laundering and money in politics for the Center for American Progress, Alex Talsanovich, a Russian defector, and Diana Pilipenko, also a lady who defected from the Russians for U.S. citizenship, both proved the following, and I quote as they, verbatim. Because it is illegal for foreign nationals to spend money in United States campaigns, obscuring funds coming from, say, an agent of the Russian government, by funneling them through an organization like the NRA, is functionally nothing more than money laundering. Helson's affidavit and material gathered by pro-firearm safety reform groups make it clear Maria Butina's project linking the Republican Party to the Russians via the gun lobby was not just an election year connection. Needless to say, the firearm safety reform groups have been having a field day with the NRA ever since, and with the Russians and the Republican Party, whereas the gun lobby itself has been completely silent about their criminality as an international terrorist network. Now, Avery Gardner, co-president of the Brady campaign to eliminate gun violence, has said, saying we have serious concerns about a Russian national with deep ties to the NRA, an organization that helped fund and elect Donald Trump as president, being herself arrested on charges of espionage, doesn't go nearly far enough. The NRA says it is the president's most unflinching ally, and we demand the NRA's leadership answer at once long-standing questions about their organization's Russian connections, especially as pertinent to the 2016 campaign, which gave us a puppet president. Now, the organization known as Everytown for Gun Safety not only ran details of the Butina NRA linkage, but provided visual evidence as well. A picture of her posing with NRA Executive Vice President Wayne LaPierre, the extremist power broker who actually runs the gun lobby. Oliver North himself having no brains with which to do so, and he be outgoing anyway. Before that, Everytown has proven, Torsion, Butina's later handler, became friends with then NRA President David Keene, circa the year mine own late and sainted mother was murdered, 2011. And she herself joined the group a year later. Both Russians set up an NRA model Russian gun rights group, even though Russian law bars any private gun licenses. And after a 2013 conference of their group in Moscow, Butina and Torsion got a top United States speaker, John Bolton, now Trump's national security advisor, to record a pro-Russian gun rights video in an empire where all firearms are outlawed for personal ownership. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. And in 2014, Butina attended her first of 3 consecutive NRA conventions. Torsion and Butina's attendance at NRA conventions gave them access to prominent Republican figures, inclusive Donald Trump himself, the governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, the former senator of Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum, and then Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal. Walker, Santorum, and Jindal also sought the Republican Party presidential nomination circa 2015 through 2016, but all of them were paid, bribed, by the Russians to drop out early, so that only Trump himself would win it. Agent Helson's affidavit traces Butina's plan back to early 2015 and included a forecast to, well, it was writ that very year, and even then calculated the Republican Party would win the White House circa 2016 with Russian invasion of cyberspace. All of this via an intensive operation working through the National Rifle Association to get through to the Republican Party in total control via NRA blood money, which the Republicans swim in. That's why their party identifies by the color red. All of which made sense for the Russians and their own affiliation with that communist shade. This very organizational agenda put into writing, captured with the agent Butina herself, kicked off the influence plan in a March 24th, 2015 email to an unnamed United States political official after going over her conspiracy with her handler. Other sources identify that United States political official as a Florida Republican campaign consultant, to whom she emailed the following. I read it to you. A major United States political party, hereinafter referred to as Political Party Number 1, will likely gain control over the United States government after the 2016 elections with our Russian help. That political party number 1 is traditionally associated with negative and aggressive foreign policy towards Russia. However, now that the right negotiates, it seems best to build konstruktivnie relationships. Konstruktivnie means constructive relations. And that central place and influence in the political party 1 plays the gun rights organization as our beachhead in America. That phrase, our beachhead in invading America, is immediately followed by details which make us clear the gun rights organization be the National Rifle Association. The firearms safety reform groups have confirmed that FBI agent Helson's affidavit understates the case, if anything. This is a foreign invasion utilizing a hostile group of domestic terrorists to take over your world. You are under occupation. Your fantasies of the man in the high castle with all your World War II delusions about the Krauts and the Japs have left you wide open for the Satanists and the motherfucking Russians to walk all over your fucking face, which they then take and slam in the toilet and make you drink your shit water till you drown. FBI agent Helson's affidavit goes on to detail how Butina carried out her plan, with mentions of the NRA, always as part of her contacts with Republican leaders. The pro-firearm safety reform organizations, however, dug up her direct contact with Donald Trump. Butina posed as a reporter during the 2015 Trump press conference in Las Vegas, where she asked, "Do you want to continue the politics of sanctions that are damaging both our oil economies, that of Russia and the United States?" Trump's reply included the following sentence. I quote it in verbatim. "I know Putin. I believe I would get along very nicely with Putin, okay? I don't think we need the sanctions. I would eliminate all sanctions against Russia." Now, the massacre of 11 people at a Pittsburgh synagogue but half a year agone in October or yesteryear was terrifyingly predictable based on everything I have just articulated, with an equally predictable response. President Trump and members of Congress denouncing the violence, but displaying no signs whatsoever of actually doing anything. Why is it that polls show that voters want more gun safety laws legislated on the books, yet Congress can't pass any? The one sole reason be the National Rifle Association, the heavyweight player in this last presidential election and every election. And today, after the Russian-sponsored shootout at a STEM school, educating our future leaders in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the National Rifle Association once again will help deflect what surveys prove it be the people's will to stop this endless wave of terror via gun safety reform under rule of law. I speakest myself thusly as a former National Rifle Association member. Yes, I once had the card. And mine own late and sainted sire, George Joseph Henry Dietrich, grew up near the countryside. His own 12th birthday present was his own .22 rifle, which he kept in our home and near his presence, nigh till the day he died. And George Joseph Henry Dietrich himself, Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, retired, would have been the first to acknowledge, were he by my side tonight, that the National Rifle Association was once a great organization for shooting enthusiasts. But it has been hijacked by extremist leaders, committed not to their members' much more reasonable views, but to hardline resistance of any and all firearm safety regulative reform, regulatory reformation. All nation-states on earth have violent, hateful people, but only in the United States of America do we provide them ready access to assault weapons and large-capacity magazines. All because of the National Rifle Association and its total political control over America. The National Rifle Association was established circa 1871 because of the fact that American troops of the United States, the boys in blue, the soldiers who fought for Union throughout the Civil War between the states, proved themselves terrible marksmen. The Second Amendment, in those days, aftermath the Civil War between the states, no one spraketh of it. Almost everyone in and out of the NRA accepted that there should be restrictions on firearms. In his book entitled The Second Amendment, Michael Waldman notes that gun control laws were ubiquitous throughout the 19th century. Visitors to Wichita, Kansas, had to check their revolvers at police headquarters. And as for Dodge City, a symbol of the Wild West, a photo from the time shows a sign on Main Street, circa 1879, warning, "The carrying of firearms be strictly prohibited." In the 1920s and 1930s, the NRA favored tighter gun laws, and its president, Carl Frederick, said that the carrying of weapons should be sharply restricted and only under license. Circa 1934, the United States helped pioneer modern gun laws with the National Firearms Act, with the blessings of the NRA itself, and came very close to banning all handguns completely and forever. As recently as the 1960s, the decade into which I myself entered this vale of tears, the NRA supported, albeit more grudgingly, limits on firearms. But circa 1977, there was a coup d'etat within the NRA that put Russian-sponsored hardliners in charge, some of them agents of the KGB. The group began calling for repeal of the 1968 Gun Control Act and doubled down on a full-time lobbying arm to oppose firearms restrictions. In effect, the group took an extremist turn that continues to destroy American life today. America's gun culture and Canada's had been similar, circa the 1950s and 1960s, focused on rifles used for hunting. Circa 1959, a survey found that 60% of Americans favored a ban on handguns. Then, at the time of peace with the Japanese Empire, circa 1952-1953, whilst other nation-states steadily tightened their firearms laws, the United States, under influence of the Russian-infiltrated NRA, moved to emphasize handguns and personal security, building on public anxieties about crime. So the United States resisted that global trend and instead passed a series of concealed carry laws. Leaders of the NRA fervently backed a new movement to reinterpret the Second Amendment, which had been regarded as a relic having to do with state militias, as instead now protecting individual gun rights. Circa 1991, the year I suffered exposure to cyclosarin nerve gas in Operation Desert Storm. That same year, former Supreme Court Chief Justice Warren Burger, himself a true conservative, dismissed calls to reinterpret the Second Amendment as, in his own words, one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. Now that fraud be the law of the land. That reinterpretation of the Second Amendment be tribute to the undeniable effectiveness of the NRA's relentless campaigning and the power of the NRA in changing American mores have resulted in a constitutional right to bear arms, a blizzard of concealed carry permits, and in tough stand-your-ground laws that have resulted in inner-city safaris conducted by white men to kill young black men, in which they can simply claim the black man attacked them or looked as if he were going to attack them, and they shot him in self-defense. 100% of the time, the white man is given legal carte blanche to kill as many blacks as he wants, under full protection of the law. In contrast to Canada, the United States now has a white supremacist gun culture focused on handguns, assault weapons, and racist paranoia. All because of the Russian-controlled National Rifle Association. In all fairness, let us also note that progressives have periodically driven moderate gun owners into the arms of the NRA, with muddled commentary indicating that they didn't know anything about the firearms they wanted to regulate. Circa 2013, for example, New York State banned loading magazines with more than 7 rounds, with many lawmakers apparently not realizing that for many guns there are no magazines holding 7 or fewer rounds. Even now, the NRA's strategy be largely to pounce on liberal comments about quote-unquote gun control. The very reason I myself prefer the less threatening term firearm safety reform. And the NRA leverages all liberals to frighten gun owners so that they become ever more engaged in Russian treason. On one of the NRA's websites the other day was a headline that read, I'll read it to you right now. DC area witches unite for gun control. Hurl curses at the NRA. Oh, and here's another headline while I'm on site. New Jersey to gun owners. Hand over those magazines or we could throw you in jail. Now, responsive to the Orlando massacre, in particular, that atrocity is meaningful to myself because my surrogate son almost died that night. It was the deadliest attack by a gunman in American history until the massacre at Las Vegas. At the time of Orlando, the NRA blamed the massacre on, of all things, the Obama administration's political correctness. Believe that shit? And not the terrorist access to, as they put it, so-called assault weapons. All while the National Rifle Association advertised that semi-automatics are the most popular firearms sold in America for sports shooting, hunting, and self-defense. Because, you know, self-defense be so integral to sports shooting and hunting. By the way, sports shooting and hunting, they are different. Sports shooting would mean like you're plinking at targets that presumably are inanimate, like cans. Hunting is when you're killing animals, or what the NRA would call niggers. Self-defense is when anyone finally fights back against you, the motherfucking white supremacist gun owner, who's got the super aggressive assault weapon. Make no mistake, the NRA paved the way for the Orlando attack in which my surrogate son almost died, during which Omar Mateen killed at least 100 people. And here's how they did it. The NRA's lobbyists and political allies fought for a raft of permissive state gun laws, turning Florida in particular into what they called the gunshine state. The gun lobby's gusher of campaign cash and threats of electoral retribution cowed Florida's, and indeed the United States' federal leaders into inaction on gun control, even in the face of the slaughter of first graders, an assassination attempt on a member of Congress, and the rise of homegrown terrorists throughout the year in which my surrogate son almost died. The NRA's politicking has warped the Constitution itself. The late Antonin Scalia authored the 2008 Supreme Court decision that recast the Second Amendment as a guarantee of individual gun rights. He was a man who, when he died, it was found that there was child pornography in his computer that led to the arrest and downfall of the free energy freak, promoted for years by James Arthur Yanchik, the man known as Sterling Allen David, David Allen Sterling, the same 3 first names, always arranged in different order. His computer had been loaned to Justice Scalia, and what was found on it led to his own downfall. The best friend of James Arthur Yanchik, the man he promoted for 20 fucking years. And people ask why I severed relations with that white trash piece of shit. Today, the NRA's top Senate allies are blocking a Supreme Court nominee who could limit or reverse that decision. The combined effect? Military derivative weapons be ubiquitous, cheap, and simple to obtain, even for individuals on the FBI's terrorist watch list, as Mateen himself was. The NRA's unhinged gun advocacy has created a soft underbelly to our homeland security that radicals be exploiting to inflict mass murder. Let's follow the road backwards to America the Vulnerable. You might remember Michael Aquino's co-religionist, General Paul Vallely, the man who co-authored the book Mind War with Michael Aquino, where they advocate conducting psychological operations against the American public 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year with no respite until they break the back and the mind of America. That same man, General Paul Vallely, stated on record he was the creator of the Islamo-fundamentalist front for the ISIS mercenary corporation, whereas I myself exposed that ISIS was based, headquartered in the United States, in Arizona, with stocks shared by the man himself who was running Arizona into the ground, who had once himself run for president, John McCain, with offices in the Ronald Reagan building in Washington, D.C., open on the stock market for you yourself to buy shares in. That same ISIS mercenary incorporation was consulted with Paul Vallely in coordination to create an Islamo-fundamentalist false front on the ground in theater, North Africa and Southwest Asia. They bailed out convicted felons from all over Dwar al-Islam, or the House of Submission, the Muslim world. Set them loose with NRA-provided guns, funded by Russian sponsorship, to terrorize Syria, destabilize it, so that Russia could invade. These ISIS-inspired terrorists are even now exploiting our nation's unique and astonishingly easy access to military derivative weapons, where a semi-automatic AR-15, the firearm of choice for all school shootings, can be purchased in under 10 minutes. In the year of 2017 alone, the year my surrogate son almost died, we saw 2 mass shootings that stood out in San Bernardino, Texas, and Orlando, Florida, both conducted by self-radicalized terrorists who secured weapons for their mass slaughter with the most trivial of efforts, even though both of them were on watch lists and had criminal records. These terrorists be exploiting a vulnerability identified in jihadi training manuals of Islamo-fascist ISIS, using the term the reactionaries themselves coined, the fundamentalist jihadi holy warriors have training manuals and their training materials, videos and audio, going back over a decade, identify the one thing that enables them to function in the field: American gun laws. All of their weapons in the field are purchased in the United States. A terrorist manual discovered in Afghanistan in the early 2000s, titled "How Can I Train Myself for Jihad?" encourages would-be terrorists to obtain military-grade weapons only in America. I'll read from it from the Arabic. I have it. Hand it to me. by a man who once joined a jihadi organization, and just as he was about to fire on fellow Americans in the field, came to his senses, escaped, and worked his way back to the United States. Obviously, for reasons of his own personal security, I'm not going to name this young man. But he gave me his training manual. In the Arabic, it says, and I read it now, verbatim in translation. Some states of the USA, it be perfectly legal for members of the public to own certain types of firearms. If you live in such a country, obtain an assault rifle legally, preferably AK-47 or variations. The AR-15, which the NRA calls America's rifle, is the domestic cousin of the Russian AK-47. Buy yourself an arsenal. The year my late and sainted mother died was the same year a 2011 Al-Qaeda recruitment video included similar advice. Again, from the Arabic, I translate, America is absolutely awash with easily obtainable firearms. You can go down to a gun show at the local convention center and come away with a fully automatic assault rifle without any background check, and most likely without even having to show an identification card. So what are you waiting for? Literally, that's what they say. So what are you waiting for? Despite the stated intent of international terrorist organizations to exploit America's non-existent gun laws to wage jihad here on our home soil, our National Rifle Association cowed Congress has refused to act. Just December the year before yesteryear, in wake of the San Bernardino massacre, 54 senators, 53 of them fucking Republicans, voted to block a measure that would restrict gun purchase by individuals on the FBI's terror watch list. They want the terrorists to have full access to firearms. That was their open and stated intent. General Paul Vallely at the time said, if we don't allow them to buy the guns here, they won't be able to fight in the field, and then ISIS will not be able to conduct Arab Spring. And he fully stated he wanted an American Spring. And you people let these people walk your streets alive. That firearm safety reform legislation, a bill sponsored by the California Democrat Dianne Feinstein, when it failed, she rebuked her colleagues, and I give her all credit for that. She's saying, if you need proof that Congress is a hostage to the gun lobby, look no further than today's vote. Omar Mateen had been on and off the FBI watch list for all intents and purposes his entire fucking life. It's unclear that Feinstein's legislation could have prevented this monster from obtaining the Sig Sauer MCX Black Mamba he used to carry out his massacre. But it would have created a line of defense against like-minded radicals, then on the FBI's radar, and now still so. All frustrated by Second Amendment fundamentalism. The reason being, we're told, that people on the FBI terror watch list can't possibly be restricted from gun ownership is because of, wait for it, the goddamn Constitution. Florida Senator Marco Rubio, explaining his no vote December yesteryear, insisted such lists be imperfect, terrorist watch lists, you know. And he wouldn't stand for Americans having their Second Amendment rights being impeded upon. Because, you know, the rights of arms, the rights to bear arms, be so much more important than human lives, especially those of school children. And yet, this individual right to bear arms touted by the NRA for generations by now, is a newly minted right. The Supreme Court only sided with the gun lobby's interpretation of the Second Amendment, guaranteeing individual Americans, not well-regulated militias, mind you, well-fucking-regulated militias, the original terminology, instead of such networks. It was reinterpreted under bribery to guaranteeing individual Americans a right to gun ownership as opposed to well-regulated state militias. In the 2008 Heller case, in which a precarious 5-4 decision forced through by a single vote, as authored by the late Justice Scalia, the man with the child born in his computer, tracing him directly on a personal relationship to Sterling Allen David, the free energy freak, the arms enthusiast, who mysteriously died on a hunting trip, authored that reinterpretation, pushed through by his own single vote, which enabled all the deaths we've suffered ever since, and with Scalia's own death, well earned, to carry him to hell and damnation eternal, and his vacancy he left upon the court. The current interpretation of the Second Amendment outlined in Heller could have been reversed, or more likely constrained. And cases at the appellate court level were already ruling that Heller permits significant limits on gun ownership. At that time, local bans on assault rifles and large-capacity magazines were being upheld. Just yesteryear, the Ninth Circuit Court ruled that there be no constitutional right to carry a concealed weapon. Without a gun rights stalwart occupying Scalia's seat, it was hard to see these appellate decisions endorsing firearm safety reform being overturned. And yet they were when Trump became president and was able to push instead his man, the sexual assault predator, the SAP, the SAP, Brett Kavanaugh, into place. All through bought politicians. The unprecedented decision to not offer President Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, a hearing was driven by Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, whose most recent re-election bid that I bothered to analyze, circa 2014, was financed by well over $1 million United States dollars in outside spending by the National Rifle Association, now traced directly to Vladimir Putin. Mitch McConnell was quite explicit about whose water he was carrying in a March interview yesteryear conducted with Fox News' Chris Wallace, insisting the Republican Party would block Garland even in the event that Hillary Clinton had won the presidential election, saying, and I quote as T verbatim, "I can't imagine that a Republican majority in the United States Senate would want to confirm in a lame duck session a nominee opposed by the National Rifle Association." And indirectly by motherfucking Russia. And that brings us to Florida, where my surrogate son almost died that fateful night. The so-called gunshine state, with gun control safely stymied in the Senate. The National Rifle Association then focused its energies in the states, lobbying to make the purchase of deadly weapons easy and to encourage citizens to bring guns out of the home and into the public. Florida is no longer the sunshine state. The sun no longer shines. It's called the gunshine state for a reason. The state has issued more than 3 million concealed carry permits since 1987. That means there's well over 3 million people walking around in what on the map looks like the penis of North America, carrying firearms in their pants pocket. Thanks to a collaboration between Jeb Bush, the brother of George Bush's mini-me, the retard who became our president for 2 terms, made our president by Jeb Bush himself and his personally appointed judge, overruling the legal victory of Al Gore, all in coordination with the NRA. Florida pioneered the infamous Stand Your Ground law, circa 2005, that emboldened people to deploy these hidden handguns whenever they felt threatened. A study out of Texas A&M University proved such laws increase murder and manslaughter by a statistically significant 9%. In 2008, Florida even passed a law allowing permit holders to drive their guns to work and leave them unattended in their cars with their infant children in carry case seats. After all, an infant's fingers wouldn't be able to pull a trigger, would they? What about the man who might come by, crash open your window, and use the handgun to blow your baby's brains out? Oh, fuck, he wouldn't waste a bullet, would he? Now, Florida's governor, last time I checked, was a top ally of the gun lobby, earning an A+ rating for opposing universal background checks, among all other safeguards. What led, of course, to the Parkland massacre on St. Valentine's Day, under direct orders of Vladimir Putin for the 300 of his men that were chewed to pieces by American firepower the day before. A mass assassination that targeted minorities and females, all enrolled for officer school at West Point, to prevent minorities and females from becoming officers to lead our military to a victory against the Russians, because any white motherfuckers in the field who were male and have a cock between their legs would surrender to the Russians in a heartbeat. The Russians would simply say, whites don't kill whites, and American officers would order their men of all races and genders to throw their guns down and turn themselves over. The bastards did it in World War II at the Battle of the Bulge, surrendering at a divisional level, entire regiments in the field. You can bet your sweet ass the whites would do it again, confronted by the Russians. In 2014, the NRA sent out a celebratory alert saying, Governor Rick Scott makes history signing 5 pro-gun bills. The NRA at that time reportedly spent $2 million United States dollars on a late push to support Florida Governor Rick Scott's re-election. In the state legislature, year before yesteryear, NRA-allied politicians pushed for Florida to join the ranks of states that allowed total open carry of guns and to prohibit concealed carry on college campuses. Meaning, they wanted people to carry openly on college campuses. That's what allowed the young half-Cuban, half-Russian, white trash piece of shit, Nicholas Cruz, to carry his firearm onto Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School property without any security guard being allowed to apprehend him. It was his right. And then, of course, he went on his assigned mission of murder. His training provided on record by the NRA, which sank thousands of dollars into training him to be able to hit a nickel or a dime on a target range. If you don't understand by now the NRA being a foreign terrorist network, a hostile insurgency on American soil, you never will. Now, while Florida has a 3-day waiting period for handguns, that restriction, believe it or not, doesn't apply to assault rifles. That's how Nicholas Cruz was able to buy his firearms within 24 hours of massacre. Nor does the state of Florida have any restrictions on large capacity ammunition magazines. That's how Omar Mateen, the man who almost killed my surrogate son, was able to walk into his local gun shop and walk out with his Sig Sauer MCX the same fucking day. Mateen then deployed this weapon of mass murder, developed for use by special forces, and touted by the company which manufactured it as equipped with a mil-spec trigger, a military specialist trigger, a hair trigger, to fire off 24 rounds in one single 9-second burst. Florida's non-existent gun laws are enabling rage-filled predators. The Pulse nightclub massacre, in which my son almost died, was only one of 2 ghastly public killings in Orlando that weekend. The Voice alum, Christina Grimmie, was gunned down while signing autographs after a concert the Friday night before, into the weekend in which 100 men died, and some woman, at Pulse nightclub. One might imagine that this 101 people dead within 48 hours, this clear and all too obvious threat to public safety and homeland security, would lead to a reconsideration of Florida's all too permissive gun culture. But the state's Republican leaders have never backed down. At least not until the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and I haven't maintained watch on them since. I can't stand the sight. It makes me sick. Because I remember Governor Scott himself, when pressed on whether assault rifles ought to be restricted in the wake of the Orlando massacre, he insisted, on record, the Second Amendment didn't kill people. Evil killed people. Well, evil in the form of Republicans, the NRA, and the goddamn Russians. School shootings, Ritalin, the NRA's culture of convenient excuses. Guns don't kill people. Evil kills people. Well, who's evil? Republicans, Russians, and the NRA. But instead we get, it's Ritalin. It's a culture of death. It's not enough religion. And too many violent video games. Those, we're told, are the things causing America's almost rhythmic school shootings. That's where the blame was placed again that weekend yesteryear as students and families and pundits and lawmakers grappled with one Black Friday's slaughter of 10 children at a high school in Santa Fe, Texas. Now, that school shooting occurred at Santa Fe High School in Santa Fe, Texas, United States, in the Houston metropolitan area on May 18th, just yesteryear. 10 human lives, 8 students, 2 teachers, were fatally shot, and 13 others were critically injured. The suspected shooter, as they referenced him, was taken into custody and later identified by police as Dimitrios Pogortsis, a 17-year-old student at the school. That shooting at the time was the second deadliest school shooting in the United States, even up to yesteryear. After the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in February resulted in 17 deaths and 17 critical injuries. which then took the lead as deadlier. And at that time, the retired lieutenant of the United States Marine Corps, Lieutenant Colonel, that is, Oliver North, the then incoming president of the National Rifle Association, had the audacity to say on Fox News Sunday, and I quote his T verbatim, "The problem that we've got is we're trying like the dickens to treat the symptom without treating the disease." Am I getting his voice? Let's just try a bit. "And the disease in this case isn't the Second Amendment. The disease is youngsters who be steeped in a culture of violence. They've been drugged in many cases. Nearly all of these perpetrators are male, and they're young teenagers in most cases, and they've come through a culture where violence is commonplace. All we need to do is turn on the TV, go to a movie. If you look at what has happened to young people, many of these young boys have been on Ritalin since they was in kindergarten." And then Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, using ABC's This Week as his platform, had the audacity to parrot that party line, saying, "We've devalued life, whether it's through abortion, whether it's the breakup of families, through violent movies, and particularly violent video games, which now outsell movies and music. But we have to look at our culture of violence, just our violent society, our Facebook, our Twitter, the bullying of adults on adults and children on children. We have to look at ourselves. It's not about the guns. It's about us. The guns are always innocent. Of course, the gun is their god Moloch, who can never be implicated. To quote the great comic strip character Pogo by cartoonist Walt Kelly from my late and sainted father's childhood, we have met the enemy and he be us, right? Well, yes, but not in the ways Oliver North and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and a slew of other gun-protecting folks want you to believe. The "our culture is causing mass shootings" argument is compelling and can sound reasonable on a visceral level. But it's all based on emotion, not reality. According to the global marketing firm Newzoo, N-E-W-Z-O-O, the 5 nation states that spend the most money on video games are Communist China, the United States, the Empire of Japan, and Die Neue Vereinigte Deutschland, the new United Germany, as well as the United Kingdom. So, using data from the year 2016, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington found that the rate of violent gun deaths per 100,000 people in those countries I've just articulated be 0.06 per 100,000 in Communist China, 3.85 or 4 per every 100,000 in these United States, 0.04 for the Empire of Japan per every 100,000 people, and 0.12 for the new United Germany per every 100,000 people. And finally, in the United Kingdom, 0.07 for every 100,000 people. The one nation that stands out most glaringly, obviously, be these United States. You see, violent video games are obviously available everywhere. But America's gun violence rate is staggeringly higher, by orders of magnitude, than those other top video game consuming countries that I've just articulated. So how about the importance of religion in our society? A Pew Research Center study found that little more than half of Americans say religion is very important in their lives. Does that indicate moral decay that would turn boys into monsters? Let's look at the other countries referenced by myself. Communist China. Communism is, of course, state atheism. So only 3% out of 1 billion people in communist China say religion is very important. In the Empire of Japan, only 11% say so. The United Kingdom and the new United Germany are both at 21%. North of our border in Canada, only 27% of people think religion is very important in their lives. So our level of religiosity be quite high compared to all those nations, including our northerly neighbor, but our gun violence problem is off the goddamn charts. Abortion. Oh, they bring that up. According to data from a study released just yesteryear by the Guttmacher Institute, the number of abortions per 1,000 women aged 15 through 49 years of age in these United States, out of 1,000 women, mind you, between that very large spectrum of age in these United States was but 13. The rate was actually the same in the United Kingdom. Sweden actually had a higher abortion rate at 18 per 1,000 women. But there were only 41 people shot to death there the last time I checked, which I think was yesteryear. As for violent movies, those are shown in other countries that have minor to non-existent gun violence problems. And Ritalin, that universal boogeyman, it's not unique to America, you know. Iceland, which is gun violence free, saw the use of the drug commonly used to treat ADHD, adult deficit hyperactivity disorder. In Iceland, their administration of it in prescribed regimen to their school children jumped well over 230% between the years 2004 and 2014. It more than doubled within a decade. And yet nobody shot anybody. Furthermore, there hasn't been any indication that the Santa Fe shooter in Texas, but yesteryear, was taking any Ritalin. And a 2000 report, released, of course, in the opening year of our third Christian millennium, on school shootings, conducted in part by the United States Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center, in cooperation with the Department of Education, found that few of the attackers had ever been diagnosed with any mental disorder prior to incident. Additionally, fewer than 1/3 of attackers have ever had histories of any drug or alcohol abuse. These cultural factors can all be concerning in their own right, but they most definitively are not to blame for America's gun violence epidemic. If they were, other countries would have the same problems. There's only one significant factor that separates these United States of America from places like England and the Empire of Japan and the new United Germany and the Kingdom of Sweden. We have an illogical number of easily accessible firearms. And if we want to do something about how oft teenagers and adults deploy these firearms to kill fellow Americans, we must be able to have an honest discussion, not one based on drummed up cultural hysteria. Personally, I'd like to melt all the guns down, forge a giant steel statue of a hand making a "fuck you" finger gesture, and place that statue directly outside the NRA's headquarters. But I realize that's wildly unrealistic, truth be told. and embarrassingly childish to boot. Nevertheless, it's a fun image. A fantasy of, shall we say, obscene proportions. So instead, let's talk about stronger enforcement of existing firearms regulations, a return of the federal assault weapons ban, limiting the size of gun magazines, or a federal safe storage law that might help prevent cases as occurred that year in Santa Fe where the teenage shooter was able to access his father's guns. And let's listen to suggestions on making schools safer. When the lieutenant governor of Texas wasn't reciting canned lines about cultural issues, he actually made a reasonable point about limiting the number of ways students can enter a school, allowing school officials a better chance to screen people. Of course, arming teachers, as suggested by Donald Trump, be exactly what the Russians want. It's just a way to give more children access to firearms by knocking their old teacher down, taking his gun off, and shooting everybody in sight. In other words, arming teachers is intended to kill Americans. It's crazy. Take that idea out of your ass and flush it down the toilet where your turds go. We already can't pay teachers enough just to teach, let alone become marksmen. But since we're not going to turn all the guns into an inappropriate statue, per my fantasy, the idea of making schools more secure makes more sense. Put in metal detectors. Hire more security guards. Look at it this way. Pinning the problem on cultural factors is a lazy argument, just as shouting, ban all the guns, is a complete non-starter. If we really care, if we really hurt at the thought of our children going to school assuming they're going to get shot and die any day, we can't fall back on lame excuses and we can't lean in too hard on unrealistic goals. We need to listen to each other and find some common ground. Because without a doubt, we have met the enemy, and he be half of us. Less than half, if we're talking politics. The Republicans. Half of us, that is, if we're going by gender. Because, of course, the problem really isn't the gun. The gun, after all, is simply an inorganic tool. It's the man behind the gun. And by that I mean man. The male gender. Gun carrying has become an important part of identity and self-esteem for millions of white trash piece of shit Americans in ways that liberal progressive city dwellers don't always appreciate. The last few decades have, in many ways, demoted working class white men. Their jobs have become insecure. They no longer be the family's chief breadwinner. Women and people of color have gained ground. But firing an AR-15 or packing a concealed weapon offers beleaguered white men a chance to reassert their masculinity. To such men, guns provide a sense of purpose, fulfilling a traditional manly role of protecting their families and their communities on paper, while they kill their girlfriends and their children in reality. In fact, Bushmaster, the gun company, the one that gave us Sandy Hook, marketed at that time their assault rifle with a photo of both said firearm and the headline, "Consider your man card reissue." So don't blame mental illness for mass shootings. Blame men. If you want to cut down on gun violence, first target toxic masculinity. The year 2017 brought the deadliest mass shooting in modern history to the United States, which had at that time already become home to more gun massacres than any other country in the world. The response offered by the majority of our political leaders at the time, both Democrat and Republican, was then to focus on the role of mental illness in such shootings. The day after Stephen Paddock took to a hotel room in Las Vegas with 23 fucking firearms and murdered 60 people in October of the year before yesteryear, President Donald Trump told reporters that Paddock was sick and demented, even as evidence suggested Paddock did not have a confirmed mental health disorder. Trump was also quick to blame mental illness on the mass shooting at a Texas church in early November that same year, saying at a press conference briefing the following day that in and of itself the tragedy was not a gun situation, but instead a mental health problem at the highest level. Now that was the truth. The mental health problem at the highest level of the Oval Office. Because as we began the new year after that, it should have been time to have a more nuanced discussion about what might really be to blame for the trend of mass shootings in America. You know, the trend that never stops. It's always in perpetual motion. It's always trendy. Masculine massacre. That, as well as the gun violence epidemic more broadly. No, it isn't mental illness. It's gender. If we want to stop the problem of mass shootings, we need to fix the problem of toxic masculinity. As far as I'm concerned, by evisceration if we have to. Castration if I could. If you take time to dig into the research, you'll find that mental illness does not play a role in mass shootings and other gun violence that many, especially our politicians, claim it does. Serious mental illness has been found to be conclusively present in a minority of mass shootings. Only 14.8% of all of the mass shootings committed in these United States, defined as a shooting which injures or kills 4 or more people, between the year I myself had the misfortune to enter this vale of tears, 1966, and 2015, the conclusion of that particular observational study. Another study, focusing on different data collections of generalized mass murder from 1949 through 2015, attributed 23% of those incidents to the mentally ill. Studies have also found that those with serious mental illnesses are responsible for just 4% of the incidences of interpersonal violence and less than 1% of all firearms-related homicides annually perpetrated in these United States. Generally speaking, people with mental illnesses are far more likely to be victims of firearm violence than to commit it. Yet, while most mass shooters in the past 35 years have not been found to have a serious mental illness, nearly 100% of them do have one thing in common. They've got a cock between their legs. Of the 96 mass shootings committed between 1982 and the year before yesteryear, all but 2 were committed by men. Almost 100% of them being, you guessed it, white trash pieces of shit. Men don't just constitute almost all mass shooters in recent history. They are also responsible for the overwhelming majority of firearms-associated deaths throughout this country. Men own guns at triple the rate of women in these United States, at 62% compared to 22%, and also commit suicide at nearly triple the rate of women. Thank God. I only wish the overwhelming majority of them would do so, and just leave more women for me. But more troubling, because other people get involved and victimized, 89% of murder-suicides be committed by men, and most often include an unwitting female partner or ex-partner who's not even expecting it. Murder-suicides claim 1,200 American lives each and every single year. Nigh 100% of them, each and every one, committed with a gun. In fact, more than half of mass shootings, 54%, are actually domestic violence incidents. And according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which tracks court cases involving domestic violence, 86% of the perpetrators of domestic violence documented in court cases are men. To be sure, a variety of factors be associated with committing serious violence, such as a history of binge drinking, childhood abuse, living in a neighborhood with a high rate of violent crime, and experiencing stressful life events. But being a male is in and of itself off-listed as one of the top 2 predictive risk factors for committing serious violence in peer review papers on this topic, more than any mental health diagnosis. In addition to gender, a history of alleged or convicted domestic abuse has also been found to be overwhelmingly more prevalent among mass shooters than any definitive mental health diagnoses. Something that's just starting to get some much needed attention. Furthermore, women live through those same experiences, all of them, from childhood abuse to stressful life events, at rates far higher than men. Far higher, orders of magnitude worse. One notable exception being binge drinking, which men do at double the rate of women. Women are also up to 40% more likely than men to develop mental health conditions, according to a 2013 study conducted by Oxford University. The Oxford study found women were nearly 75% more likely than men to have depression, as clinically diagnosed, and around 60% more likely to have an anxiety disorder, while men and women were found to suffer from schizophrenia in more or less equal numbers. Given these numbers, if the propensity to commit gun violence and mass shootings were based largely on mental health or life events, then you would calculate women to commit violent attacks at rates higher than men. And yet, women commit an infinitesimally tiny fraction of these incidences. So few as to statistically not register. In fact, being of the female sex is actually considered a protective factor against ever becoming a perpetrator of any serious violence ever. So what the fuck is going on? According to sociologist Eric Maedhis, surname spelled Madfis, the male gender mass shooter connection may stem from cultural standards of how men are expected to react to stress and perceived victimization. In other words, none of these men are really suffering. They just think they are. Perceived victimization on the part of men as compared to real victimization as truly suffered by women. Now, Eric Maedhis, who is an associate professor at the Criminal Justice Department at University of Washington, Tacoma, and author of a 2014 journal article exploring the intersectional identities of American mass murderers, which I ran across in my casual refresher course on criminal psychology. Has himself concluded that women tend to internalize blame and frustration, blaming themselves, entirely unfairly so, whereas men tend to externalize all blame and frustration through acts of aggression, again, entirely unfairly, onto innocent people. This isn't just because of how men be built physically. While it's true that having higher testosterone oft be related to aggression, recent research indicates that testosterone is likely a result rather than a cause of violent behavior. It's a byproduct, biochemically, of the high that men get from committing acts of violence. This is why men commit acts of violence, to get high off their testosterone. They're rageaholics. Altogether, suggesting that societal influences probably play a far larger role in violence than any biological factor. After all, our culture be saturated in messages, whether in the media, in our military, in sports, at the workplace, or even in our educational and healthcare systems, that embrace and even endorse a distorted view of masculinity, which tends to value and encourage expressions of aggression by men. Even those men who might be suffering from mental illness are unlikely to seek out counseling because it so oft be stigmatized as weak for men to seek out help and admit any vulnerability. Among those who do make it into a therapist's office or mental health program, domestic abusers be notoriously resistant to treatment protocols. So most domestic abusers, the overwhelming majority, unfortunately, be lost causes. Hopeless cases that should simply be put out of our misery. Madfeast also notes that many men who commit mass shootings tend to be those who have failed to achieve financial and romantic success in ways that our society values and accredits as manly. As a result, Madfeast has explained, men may feel emboldened to resort to violence to gain both revenge and some level of notoriety as compensation for being denied what they thought they were owed or felt pressure to attain. Most of these guys are entitlement cases. They feel that as white, heterosexual, cisgendered men, they should simply be awarded for that. I mean, believe that shit? I mean, I'm not even saying believe that shit, like, to be funny. I mean, like, really, I can't even believe that shit myself. It's like saying, I've got 10 fingers and I got 10 toes. And for that, you should be proud of me. I mean, like, well, fuck, you were born that way. It's nothing you work towards. So being a white, cisgendered, heterosexual male, that's, you know, that's just fucking baseline. It's nothing to be particularly proud of. And it's certainly nothing for which I owe you or anyone else owes you shit. Then you got a hybrid like myself. Okay, Douglas Dietrich's here. He's Amerasian. What right does he have to shit all over Whitey? Well, let's turn towards a hybrid like myself, an Amerasian named Elliot Rodger. Elliot Rodger went on a shooting spree in Santa Barbara, California, circa 2014, after he taped a video of himself complaining about beautiful woman denying him sex because he truly just looked gay. James Oliver Huberty, who was a white trash piece of shit, shot up a California McDonald's circa 1984 after his business ventures failed. So, well, You know, if Donald Trump had gone in that direction, some people would have died, but we would have been spared what we have now, which is a failed businessman who's failed in everything he's ever fucking done, turning traitor and selling out to the Russians and getting promoted, pumped, and hacked into the Oval Office. But that aside for the moment. We could also consider the trend of post office shootings committed by disgruntled postal workers or former workers. That became so common, we used to call it going postal. Or consider the fact that nearly a third of all mass shootings oft occur in workplaces, or the many incidents involving a woman being shot for leaving or threatening to leave her abusive male partner. All this to cite Modfies yet again. If violence was just due to genetics, mass shootings would not be happening with increasing frequency or occur so much more often in these United States than in any other place in the world. It's time to have a close look at our culture and what be going on in terms of how masculinity itself is defined and characterized in America, which oft be as something that be performed or proven through acts of aggression and ultimately violence. Now let's have a reality check. According to the FBI, mass shootings, defined as shooting events that kill at least 4 people, occur on average every 2 weeks in these United States. Yes, every 14 fucking days. Every single fortune need. 14 nights. Yet we rarely, if ever, hear about the majority of them. The reason is that these shootings be easily explicable and therefore dismissible. In most mass shootings, the crimes occur at a private location and the victims are people close and well known to the shooter. Family members, neighbors, friends. Many of them be attributable to gang violence or illicit criminal activities. Others be crimes of passion. Now, school shootings only account for 4% of all mass shootings, and yet they dominate the news media and get the entire country talking about them for weeks on end. There be several reasons for this, of course. They occur in everyday public locations which are supposed to be safe. The victims are targeted and killed at random. The victims are innocent bystanders, and all too oft, children. The killers leave behind large amounts of material about themselves for the media to share. The perpetrator and victims are generally upper middle class white and privileged, this being a class issue as well as one of race and gender. And their killing sprees are specifically targeted to generate the most fear and uncertainty from the public, because the more fear and uncertainty they generate, the more attention they get. They then use all of the attention as a platform to promote themselves or whatever complaints they may have against society itself. It's the Columbine formula. It works. And as Eric Harris pointed out in his own journal, it's not about the guns. It's about the television, the films, the fame, the revolution. If this sounds like a hauntingly familiar strategy, that's because it is. You see, mass shootings in America are non-political terrorism. The correct term sociologically is apolitical. Apolitical terrorism for an empire, the American empire, that be so single-mindedly obsessed with terrorism. It's jaw-dropping to myself as a security expert that almost nobody recognizes that school shooters use the exact same strategies to disseminate fear and their twisted agendas throughout society. Terrorists deploy violence and mass media coverage to promote political or religious beliefs, or both. School shooters use violence and mass media coverage to promote their personal grievances and self-glorification. When viewed in this way, our responses to the school shooters look juvenile in comparison. Can you imagine arguing over whether misogyny made Osama bin Laden plan September 11th? Or whether video games caused Dokar Sarnaev to plant bombs at the Boston Marathon? Or whether heavy metal music inspired Tim McVeigh to blow up the Federal Building in Oklahoma City? You'd be laughed at if you presented any of those theses. In fact, when anyone goes so far as to suggest that Islam causes terrorism, they be immediately, and quite rightfully, scolded for it. Yet when it comes to school shootings, these types of discussions are not only tolerated, but they're engaged in willfully. It's not that we should respond to school shootings the same way we respond to terrorist attacks. It's that we already do. We just don't realize it, or at least acknowledge it. On the evening of May 23rd, in the 2014 year of our Lord, in Isla Vista, California, 22-year-old Amerasian Elliot Rodger killed half a dozen people and critically injured 14 others near the campus of UC Santa Barbara, the University of California at Santa Barbara, before killing himself inside his vehicle. When Elliot's creepy YouTube videos went public, declaring vengeance upon every college girl that wouldn't sleep with him, every woman who had ever heard a guy mutter something similar suddenly felt a chill run up his spine. And every woman who had ever heard her masher whisper under his breath that she would pay for it, that how dare she think herself better than he. She went to bed shuddering that night and trembling in her sleep. Because that chill, that same shudder in either gender, caused the video to be posted and reposted, sending more chills up ever more women's spines to terrorize the female gender of these United States by a bunch of men who felt that shudder of thrill. That shudder of, that's me he's speaking for. Let me post this video so I can finally terrorize women into spreading their legs for me, to serving me on their back with their ass in the air. All of that caused that video to spread cross-country like a wildfire, like a disease, like a plague, until it infected the mind of every American within a single day. Which I can assure us thee be exactly what Elliot wanted. And we've seen since then this viral dissemination over and over again. After every school shooting episode, writings and videos of the killers get passed around on the internet. Television specials show and re-show the footage, books be written, experts be hired, rinse and repeat. I myself have ever asserted that terrorism works because it takes advantage of psychological inefficiencies in our brains. We pay a disproportionate amount of attention to threatening events, and we always overestimate how likely it be for a random event to happen to us. School shootings transfix us by leveraging the exact same inefficiencies in our minds. And once they've dominated this mind space, we can't seem to shake them out of it. Yet for some reason, well, we seem to imagine potential terrorists everywhere. In airport lines, at stadium gates, in subway cars. We never see the school shooters coming. We always get caught by surprise while they're hiding in plain sight. When we think of terrorists, we think of some alien other, the bearded, turbaned man hiding in some cave on the other side of the world. Because he's so distant and so different, we let him eat at our imagination. He could be anywhere, ready to strike at any moment, hiding in behind every bush. planting a bomb on every bus or plane. We clog our airports and blast warnings through our public buildings for some imagined boogeyman who never actually be present. By contrast, we fail to spot shooter after shooter because they be so close to us and so much like us. We miss them because they be our neighbors, our classmates, our friends, or even our family members. They be right in front of our noses and we ignore them for an entire host of trivial reasons. Maybe they're just too weird, or awkward, or they're such a loser. We don't want to talk to them. We put our blinders on and pretend they're not miserable. We pretend they didn't just have that awkward outburst. We pretend they didn't just make a joke about killing their own parents. Eric Harris's friends later said that he would oft joke about blowing up the school and murdering classmates. Even after they discovered he was building bombs in his basement, they still never put two and two together. They just couldn't believe it. Not Eric. Not the guy they had played video games with and toilet papered girls' houses with. Meanwhile, the wrong sarcastic word at the airport, and you can be held in jail for days. An FBI study on school shooters found school shootings are never a result of a crazy person snapping. Most school shooters do have serious mental health or emotional issues, but they all plan their attacks months or even years in advance. And as they plan, they almost always leak information about the attack beforehand, sometimes intentionally, and sometimes in incredibly obvious ways. Both Harris and Roger had the police called on them multiple times due to suspicious behavior. Both of they had a history of strange and violent outbursts towards friends and those close to them. Both put their intentions and their angry rants up on the web for everyone to see. Elliot Rodger wrote and rewrote his plan out, sometimes including murdering his family members and stealing their car. He wrote that if someone had just searched his room, it would have all come apart. He would have been found out. Eric Harris wrote almost the exact same thing 15 years earlier. Seung-Wee Cho, another Asian, this time pure ethnic, Asian American, the Virginia Tech shooter who killed 32 people, turned in paper after paper that depicted gruesome killings and gun violence. He had a history of mental health issues and had been reported to the campus police 4 times for aggressive and antisocial behavior, particularly towards women. One of his professors went so far as to tell the board that she would rather resign than ever teach another class with him in it. Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook shooter, also had a history of mental illness and inappropriate antisocial behaviors. And he too began sharing his intentions online through forum posts and audio. Lanza had paranoid delusions about mass media and the government and began to argue that school shootings were justified as a form of protest or revolt. People around him humored him or just ignored him. No one realized he had a small armory of semi-automatic weapons in his house. Then there are those who simply be ignored. Dylan Klebold was suicidally depressed for over 2 years. He fantasized and wrote about killing himself liberally, despite getting into trouble with the law, turning in school assignments that glorified murder and suicide, and failing most of his classes senior year. His parents and friends claimed that they had no idea something was amiss. George Sordini, the middle-aged Pennsylvania man who shot up an aerobics class full of women, wrote in his own journal that since he spent the past 20 years of his life alone and miserable, there was no reason to think that the next 20 wouldn't be lonely and miserable as well. His mother had been emotionally abusive, or so he claimed. His father hadn't had a meaningful conversation with him in over 30 years. Simply put, he felt he had nothing to live for. So why not take some revenge on your way out? You know, it's the manly thing to do. Gun control gets the headlines. Mental health care gets the headlines. Violence in video games, and misogyny, and internet forums, and atheism. The list be endless at this point. Here's what doesn't get the headlines. Empathy. Listening to those around you, even if you don't like them very much. We have come to live in a culture where it be taboo, or even unacceptable, to simply check in with people emotionally and offer some empathy and understanding. I'm not saying this would magically fix all gun violence. I'm just saying that all of these things, the lack of any significant firearms laws, the lack of health care in any universal sense, the inability to have basic conversations with friends and neighbors about what's going on with them. These are all extensions of a callous and self-absorbed anti-culture, totally lacking in any concept of human empathy. Despite being relevant and important to discussion, the glamorous headlines ultimately be distraction. They just feed into the carnage and the attention and the fame the killers desire. They be distractions from what be right in front of you and I, and the victims of tomorrow's shooting. People who need help. And while we're all fighting over whose pet cause be more right and more true and more noble, there likely be another young man out there, maybe suicidally depressed, maybe paranoid and delusional, maybe a true psychopath. And he's researching guns and bombs and mapping out schools and recording videos and thinking every day of his miserable life about the anger and hate he feels for this world. And no one is paying attention to him. No one but the internet. Because these white trash pieces of shit, these turds floating in a sewer, that medium in which they float, what keeps them afloat? Be cyberspace. And what all these school shootings have in common is Russian-sponsored internet radicalization. Pushed by the white supremacist alt-right, the hostile insurgency on our shores, deep into our heartland, that cops the minds of these losers and weaponizes them. The Russians are using these white trash piece of shit losers the way they use firearms. They're a weaponized tool with no will of its own that Vladimir Putin's boys, through the NRA, arms and deploys to kill you and anyone you love. All through internet radicalization. Let's take a serious look at how online bullying and Russian propaganda pushed through the collaborationist alternative right accounts for the suicidal, homicidal tendencies in our white, male, privileged teenagers. Or more logically, privileged white male teenagers. White itself being a privilege in this culture. Now, only a few months following the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Parkland, Florida, tragedy struck again at Santa Fe High School, 30 miles south of Houston, when the student dive, a foresighted, started shooting in an art classroom with his father's shotgun and revolver. 10 people died, and 10 others were critically injured before the shooter surrendered himself to the police. Now, I've never followed up on his case very deeply, so to myself, little be known about his motives, making it difficult for myself to assume the role of commentator and blame anything specific. I do know he was not a jihadist, as was another high schooler who was caught before carrying out mass murder at Stonebriar Mall in Frisco, Texas, whom you never heard of. And I know the Santa Fe shooter was also not mentally handicapped. I do know he wasn't committed to any ideology at all, really. The only red flags Dimitrios Pegortzis ever exhibited were some morbid posts on social media and the black trench coat he wore every day, which, in the Texas heat, probably in and of itself should have aroused more suspicion. But, you know, we are talking about the home of the infamous Chainsaw Massacre and franchises built off human cannibalism. Moving right along. I couldn't resist that, Barb. Well, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo virtue signaled yet another sanctimonious campaign of gun control activism at the time. Others were discussing how to stop these troubled students before they snapped. And many schools have since attempted to follow that latter approach, training teachers and students to look for signs of violent behavior and intervene. In most cases, this means sitting through a PowerPoint presentation about depression, learning the number for a bullying hotline, and watching some video that dramatizes the situation. There's a video you should be able to find on YouTube entitled Evan, spelled E-V-A-N, produced by the Sandy Hook Promise Group, which be a perfect example. I don't mean to disparage that. It's fine. I mean, the world's a better place with that production than without it. But as practical as this strategy soundest, it fails on a number of levels. First, it assumes that identifying these types of students be easy when it oftentimes is not, despite everything I've pointed out about the standout characteristics. Secondly, it invests too much confidence in laughably superficial training. And thirdly, it completely ignores the limits of educators and students in successfully dissuading a psychotic young adult from committing mass murder. Rather than saving these troubled students, advocating intervention and watchfulness mostly encourages vicious paranoia, because theoretically, anyone can be a mass murderer. It also encourages undeserved guilt, like this kid going on a shooting rampage because students and teachers didn't care enough about him. Despite what I've said earlier about investing empathy in people, I'm presenting that as basically an antenna for feeling out those who, in truth, are undeserving of any empathy, that they may be identified. Whereas most people would take what I've said and actually distort that into something I didn't mean, where when someone does go berserk and run amok, they feel as if somehow they're responsible for not loving this person enough. And all of the aforementioned is also promotional of despair, the safety of a school resting on the maturity of classmates and the perceptiveness of teachers who all have other things on their mind. The teacher on getting through the day, the students mostly on getting laid. So these three problems result from serious misunderstandings about high schools